Hello, welcome back to Balance Redefined. I'm Connie Sokol, your host. And again, we have the pleasure of having Dr. Trish Barris with us. Hi, Trish. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
So wonderful. And we love the insights that she shares with us every single time about wonderful topics, particular to our mental and emotional health. And as you know, just as a quick way of bio reminder, she is the associate professor at University of Utah, and she has a thriving practice, a psychology practice at the Riverwoods Behavioral Health Center. So if you ever need to get a hold of her, we're going to do that at the very end of this again, but we tend to wait to the end, and I want to make sure people who want to get in touch with her know how to do that, because she has wonderful things to share to move forward. And this is why we do this, Dr. Trish. We want to not just share ideas and thoughts, but truly giving you tips for traction, being able to move forward, hearing something today, and then taking it and making it into something that's going to create a shift in your life. That's the whole point of what we're talking about. So today, we are talking about choosing happiness no matter the now, no matter what the situation is, and not in a Pollyanna way, but in an actual, I've got some tools and I've got some coping skills, and I can change the way that I feel or do this situation, right? So that's what we're going to talk about today. First and number one is, as we were kind of going through these ideas for these topics, that's what's hit me as I'm talking to women for over 20 years and being able to work with them. What is happiness? It's such a nebulous thing sometimes. And when I'm specifically talking to women, this happens to men too, they don't even know what it is that will bring them happiness. It's just they know that they don't have it. There's just this feeling of a lack of happiness, but they're not sure exactly what that means. And it can be so relative to people. So how do we go about defining happiness for ourselves?
Well, first of all, we have to distinguish. There's a difference between happiness and pleasure. Pleasure involves the five senses. It is something we smell or something we taste or something we look at. And those are all great things because they add to our happiness, but they're not happiness. And sometimes we just think that's what they are. And so they can contribute again to happiness. And then we distinguish between happiness and joy. And I think joy goes even further. It has a spiritual component. It has it's long lasting, and it's something that you work towards all of your life. But I am surprised, just like you, Connie, about the number of people who don't know what happiness is. And so it's figuring out with you what it is that makes you happy. And my students at the U, I give them this little exercise to do. It's called the good day exercise. And at the end of the day, for 2 weeks, they are to write down the things that made that day good for them. And then at the end of 2 weeks, you can see what things make you happy and put those in your life, because happiness just doesn't come. We have to put the things that make us happy into our lives.
Love that. And a very active, conscious choice. Sometimes when I'm talking with people, it's almost like they expect that happiness, little fairy, is going to come in and bring that happiness, not realizing that just like choosing what you're going to eat for breakfast, choosing if you're going to work out, it's choosing that happiness factor. Like, what am I going to do today to bring happiness into my life, or to see the things that are already making me happy in my life? So if we help people kind of go through that exercise, I love that you're giving them those ideas of, okay, try this for a week or try this for 2 weeks and just write down so you can start seeing patterns. What can we do to help them do it in a realistic way of, okay, how can I put or see happiness in my life? Like, do I do that first thing in the morning? Do I do it later at night? But I need joy during the day. What are some ways that they can see or experience happiness in the day, throughout the day?
Well, first of all, I think we have to be grateful and look for those things and make sure it's an intentional thing that we do. But again, if we put things that make us happy, for instance, if we like to exercise, or we like to do service, or some of those things that make us happy, we make sure that it's in our day. We put it intentionally in our day. And I don't think we do that enough. We think that the world just bombards us with all these things all the time that we should do and we ought to do and stuff like that, instead of what we want to do in those days. Another thing, I think we think that externals will make us happy. Money, power, looks, whatever. Those things don't make us happy. Happiness comes from inside of us, and we choose happiness. I had this little girl one time, and I'll just tell this really quick story here. She was 14 years old, and she came in and she was always miserable. And I said, "Do you want to be miserable?" And she said, looked at me like, why would I want to be miserable? And I said, because you are. You come in every week and you're miserable, even though bad things happen. I said, try being happy this week. So she did. And she came back and she says, and she was all beaming. And she says, you're right. Being happy is so much more fun.
Love. Oh, is that like out of the mouths of babes or what? Right? It's so much more fun. So what, you've got these 4 beautiful tools to the characteristics, kind of tools for happiness. Before we get to those, I want to kind of venture down that where like she was choosing to be miserable. What are some of the obstacles that we can look for to happiness? Because she was going along and being miserable. And it's so obvious that that was the problem, that was the obstacle to her happiness, but she didn't see it. What are some other obstacles that might be in our way that we're not seeing there? Or maybe everyday things that we're doing and don't realize that we just eliminate those, happiness factor increases.
Well, we know social media, sometimes it can be good, but a lot of times it can be bad, especially if we compare ourselves to others. And, you know, it's kind of human nature to compare yourself, but where we get into trouble is when we say that's better or worse than me. And so if we use comparison and say, oh, that would be a nice thing for me to implement into my life because they're happy doing it, that's fine, but not worse or better than you are because of that. And, you know, they say, and you've probably all heard this, comparison is the thief of joy. And so we have to be really careful when we do that. Also things like failed expectations. Sometimes we set our standards for ourselves way, way too high instead of what's realistic for us. Our goals should be realistic and specific and doable. And if they're not, then we're setting ourselves up to fail.
Absolutely. You are so spot on, because I noticed my sweet daughter right now is serving a church mission over in France. And the first week that she calls me, she's in tears. She said, I don't know the language. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what I'm doing. I am not doing well at this. I am so failing. And I was like, I said, you're like a newborn. You just got into a foreign country and what you're telling me you can't fluently ask for, you know, a patisserie, like for the love. So very important, those expectations. You're exactly right. That's so important for people to understand that what we can do is create those expectations in our mind that are so unrealistic. And then when we don't meet them, then we feel like a failure, but that's been a creation in our own mind and it's creating our own unhappiness. I love that.
It's really important because, again, if we don't, we have to know who we are and our abilities and go for those and focus on our strengths. And that's the other thing we do. We focus on what we're not instead of what we are. I teach positive psychology at the University of Utah. That's what we talk about, is focusing on who you are and the strengths instead of the weaknesses, what you are instead of what you're not, what your strengths are instead of your weaknesses. Because again, those things are negative in your life and create unhappiness.
You are so spot on. And I think that unhappiness factor that comes to us, that just makes us feel like all the good things that happen to us in our day, when we're hyper focused on these other things, we could have 5 wonderful things that happened. And yet, if we're going to hyper focus on comparison or false expectations or whatever might be, then suddenly we've squeezed the joy out of our day. We squeezed that happiness out, because it doesn't matter how many good things just happen. I got a parking spot up at the front, or I just got a surprise check in the mail. It doesn't matter. It's not equating to that. Do you find that you know, we hear about the compliments that you need to have. I don't know if it's 15 compliments to every negative thing that you have, and we don't even come close to that. Do you find that same thing with happiness, that people that come to see you actually have a lot of good things in their lives, but they're kind of focused on the negative? Or do you see they really do have some serious obstacles and they just need better coping skills to deal with them?
Well, both. But you know, the world is super, super negative. Everybody is negative. We're critical of everything. We don't look for the positive. And if we look for the positive, it's, oh, that's so Pollyannish or whatever. Instead of, you know, no, that's good. But sometimes there are obstacles to happiness. I mean, sometimes we've seriously been abused, or sometimes we've got health issues and things like that, but it still comes from inside. It's not what people give us. People can't give us happiness. And something else, sometimes when people, you know, are really complimentary of us, we don't take that because we don't believe it in ourselves. And so if you don't believe it in yourself, you kind of like, sure, they're just trying to be nice. It really isn't what they're meaning or whatever. But take the compliments because that's someone's perception of you. And that's good information for you to have.
It's so true. I have such a problem with when I say someone, wow, you look gorgeous today. And they're like, oh no, you know what? I had this and this and my hair wouldn't work. And it makes me feel badly for even saying something. So, and I've done this myself. Someone has complimented, oh, that was a great keynote. That was whatever. I'm like, oh, you have no idea. This morning, this and this happened with my kids. So I was running in. And instead of, I've had to learn to just say, thank you. Thank you so much. That was so gracious of you to share that. Thank you so much. That's it. That's all we need to do. We validated them. They validated us. What a beautiful exchange. And just practicing that thank you instead of making a whole big backstory, which I think we, especially as women, tend to do. I love that point. And I love that you say value the positive, and it sounds in essence, validate the difficult. So we're not being Pollyanna. We're not saying you don't have difficult things. Your spouse is abusive, or your child is having drug problems or whatever it might be. I love that point that you made, that people do tend to think if you're being positive that you're not being realistic. And that is not true. You are choosing that part of your reality to focus on. And we find Dr. Joe Dispenza, so many psychologists, Tony Robbins, motivational people who go through the whole kind of more of the neuroscience of thinking. We know that as we focus on the positive, that it creates actual physical changes in ourselves. So focusing on the negative actually is physically and emotionally detrimental. It's not just being realistic. That as we focus on the positive, you've seen those water experiments Dr. Joe Dispenza talks about and Dr. Emoto, where they see the water crystals, and even when they say the words of hate or frustration or things like that, the water crystals are brown and they're broken and fragmented. But when they do gratitude and they say happiness or joy or love, those crystals look like snowflakes, like blue snowflakes. They're gorgeous. And you can see this, it's scientifically proved. So I love that idea of we validate the difficult. Yeah, I'm going through tough times, and I'm going to value the positive. I'm going to focus on that positive. So,
in psychology, we call it the as-if principle, which is what you're talking about a little bit, is that once we start doing something, that it's neuroplasticity in the brain, that the brain creates neural pathways. So the way we think, it continues to make those neural pathways deeper and deeper, and it's hard to get out of them. So you have to practice being happy. And everybody thinks, oh, that feels so fake to me. It feels so fake. But again, after a while, you act like you want to act, and you become that. We act grumpy, and that's kind of what we don't want to act, but that's what we become, right? And so it's just being positive and practicing. It takes 27 days to break a habit, but it takes 60 days to make a new habit, which means that's 2 months. And so if we want to be more positive, it's every day. We're practicing it every day, and then it becomes part of us. It becomes a habit for us.
Oh, you are spot on. In fact, this so goes with that whole abundance mindset. I was just doing some abundance meditations from Jack Canfield, and he says that very thing. He says, do this for 30 days. You're going to have to at least do this consciously. It doesn't mean perfectly, but it means consciously, that you are consciously choosing to put energy towards that positive. And like I was saying, Dr. Joe was talking about, Dispenza was saying that when we go and focus on the negative, another thing that happens is that we are on our way to stress, which leads to disease. So the second that we start thinking stressful thoughts, that shift in our cells starts happening, and then it starts we become more prone to some kind of disease. And that, if you watch in life, that follows when you feel negative. There's usually some kind of a health issue that ends up coming up, because that the body is in a state of stress. And when we're positive, it's such a cheap, inexpensive way to have healthy living, just by being that positive. It's not just a happy little thought. This is actually healthy mental wellness, right?
One time I had a friend of mine that had cancer, and she used humor you know, she would not make fun of herself, but she would lighten things up a little bit by her humor and telling jokes and things like that and being optimistic. And literally her cancer went into remission. And, you know, she did other things. I mean, she, you know, had healthy eating and diet and stuff like that, but it went into remission and it's never come back. So positive things really do help. And when the research shows that out there.
And it does. Several of those people that I just mentioned said the exact same things, the miracles, quote unquote, that they saw happening simply by changing those things. Now, we all know if you have a broken leg, yeah, you need to go get it reset, right? But like you said, she was doing other things to help that. But if we're not doing the mental and emotional wellness factor, if we're not proactive on that, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot, because that is so powerful. It begins in the mind, where we set that intention, we set that pattern for our subconscious mind, and we say, no, this is the reality. This is the new norm. And our mind, our brain will start working to make that reality happen. So I love that. Now, we were talking about some tools to happiness, that when people are thinking, okay, I want to be happy, but how do I do that specifically in a given day? What does that look like? What we talk about, a tool belt all the time. What kind of tools can we do in there? And you talk about 4 main characteristics. What is that for happiness?
Well, the research shows that people that are happy have a lot of characteristics, but they have 4 major characteristics. And the first one is good relationships. They have good relationships with others, but they have good relationships with themselves. Being able to have a support system, people we can talk to, even when we isolate, that's not good. Because again, our perception is the only perception we see when we isolate, instead of getting other people's views on our life and that sort of thing. So that's number 1, is good relationships. And again, when we don't have a good relationship with ourselves, we can't get rid of ourselves, but we can, you know, we can become depressed and anxious and things like that. And so it's learning to look at the good in us, like we've talked about. The strengths in us are really important. And number 2, did you want to say something, Connie, on that?
No. Love it.
Okay. On number 2, the second thing is finding meaning in life. You know, when I work with people with addictions, they don't have meaning in life. They've lost it. They've lost themselves and they've lost the meaning and purpose. And it's not just maybe one overall meaning, but a lot of different meanings and purpose in our life. We need to find those. And if you're struggling with that, I have my students at the U and my patients do one thing. I have them write their legacy, which is, if you died tomorrow, which kind of sounds morbid, but it's really not. If you died tomorrow, what would you want people to know about you? And you write those things down, and that's your value system. Those are the things that are important to you. Those are the things that will give you meaning in life, is if you write those things down and see them for yourself. This is really what I am. This is what gives me integrity.
Oh, I love that. And that is something that is important on a daily basis for us to focus on, because that's not going to happen without us doing just a little bit every day. And we're developing that. Even as I mentioned, my daughter, you know, we were Skyping and she said, Mom, I so appreciate the things that you are and what you've taught me. And she started listing out those things. That was really insightful for me to see, because as a parent, you think you're teaching X and they might see Y, right? Or the things that you think you're trying to teach, they're actually just watching who you are. And that's really teaching that whole St. Francis of Assisi, you know, preach, but if necessary, use words. And it hit me. She has been watching me. So this legacy idea, I love it, because we live it today. It's not, wow, in 40 years, I'm going to become that person. She's watching me right now develop those characteristics and those values. And that's the legacy we're leaving every day. And that's part of that happiness factor, is being able to, it's actually a coping skill. It's an actual tool that we can use. So I love that. Good relationships, finding meaning in life. What's the next one?
The next one is, happy people are grateful people. They practice gratitude. They look for the good in life. And, you know, even I have a little exercise I'll give people. I'll say, at the end of the day, what was the most important thing to you that day, that happened that day? And it can be something that's just little. Maybe someone smiled at you at the grocery store and it was just uplifting to you. Or there could be major things that happened to you that day that were the best part of your day. And the second thing is, what made you grateful for that day? What was something that maybe you haven't looked at before, but that you're grateful for. I mean, we have so many beautiful things around us, our country, our nature, things like that we don't. And Nathaniel Brandon, who's this great psychologist, he's passed on, but he said that most of us sleepwalk through life. And we don't really realize we're not in life, the meaningful life, the grateful life that are so important.
Oh, you are so right. And so much is before us. And we know this cerebrally, we know it, but we got to get to carpool and we got to do a presentation at work and we got to, all of these things that are part of our life, but is not the focus of our life. And I don't know that we always value that. Gratitude exercise helps us to take a moment to value how important it is, just 30 seconds, 1 minute throughout the day, to just look around and go, wow, those trees are gorgeous. I had a neighbor a few weeks ago, and she's so sweet. She's elderly, and it had been a long day for me, long day. And I was finally getting home about 7:30. No, it was 8:30. So anyway, I was driving, and she texts me or calls me and said, she called me and she's like, hey, so my garden, remember I told you how beautiful it was in the golden light of the evening? Can you come and see my garden? And I was exhausted. And I have to tell you the truth, all I wanted was pajamas and my bed, right? That's all I wanted. And I was like, wow. And I still had another stop to make. And I said, well, here's what I have. And she sounded so sad. And I went, you know what? I can do my errand another time. I'll be there. And she's up in my neighborhood. And I have to tell the truth, I wasn't that keen about it because I was tired, but I went. And do you know what? It was that gratitude thing. I felt like divine influence was trying to help me have the very thing I needed to feel filled up. And I was pushing it aside. And as I stood there looking over the railing and being in her garden, it was this sweet healing moment. It was gorgeous and the light was coming over. And I felt the sense of God's creations. And it tears me up now even to think about it because it was just sublime. And I thought, oh, he was trying to give this to me. And I was like, in a minute, right? And this is what we do. So if we have that, take that moment for gratitude, 30 seconds, a minute, 5 minutes, there's meaning in our day. There's a fullness to our day instead of, I got to get to the next thing, got to get to the next thing.
And my dissertation was on gratitude.
Yes.
And I got to study it for over a year and how important it is. And really, truly, there are parts of us, or there are parts of the world that they don't practice gratitude very much. It's just kind of like there. But when we are down and when we're depressed, just to write down the things in our life that we're grateful for will pull us out of depression. They will help us do that. I had a friend who used to say that, go home, because when I'd get upset, she'd go, now you go home and you write down 100 things you're grateful for. And I thought, oh, but you know what? It's not that hard once you start doing it. Yeah.
It's so true. And I don't know about you, but it's like a blooming. You go, oh, I'm grateful for this. And then another set of petals comes up and you go, oh, and then I'm grateful for this and this. And you get these small little things that you wouldn't have paid attention to, but that once you acknowledge them, it's almost a healing thing for your body and soul of going, you're right. Look at all this good in my life. And it just keeps opening and opening and opening. Love that. Oh, I'm feeling it to my soul. And then what's the fourth thing?
The fourth thing is happy people set goals. They're driven by goals. Their life just isn't haphazard. They decide these are the goals that I want to work on, but they're not unrealistic goals like we talked about a little bit earlier. They are things that are specific and doable. And something else that's huge with setting goals is the accountability piece. That you tell people, oh, I have this goal to lose 10 pounds, or I have this goal to stop being on social media so much. Will you check up on me? Because I need that in my life. I need someone to know that this is what I'm working on. And it's a huge factor is to have that accountability piece.
Oh, it's huge. In fact, studies show that it makes any goal success 70% more likely and more sustainable just because of the accountability factor. I know in the programs that I do, I see that huge difference with the ones that do the accountability phase and they have that factor in all that we do. They rock it just because there's someone who's in their side, got their back, it's in their corner. They're like, you can do this. And then they see things that help them. So if someone knows you want to lose 10 pounds, they can send a little thing, say, hey, I saw this thing the other day at blah, 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 blah at the gym, and they're doing a 2-for-1 pass or whatever. People start kind of combining to help you achieve the very thing that you want to do. Again, good relationships, helping you find meaning in life, all of those things combine to make this beautiful simmering happy stew. It just makes it, meaningful. So on one, I want to kind of go really quickly for the last few minutes. We have this on kind of one side, then when I'm talking with women particularly, but men and women, I've noticed there's a couple of things that happen. One, they tend not to validate that their happiness is okay. They're focused on happiness for their kids and things like that. And we're going to talk more about in the next section. But I also noticed that there's kind of dream stealers and happiness stealers. There's people that see them trying to get happy and they kind of shred them. They kind of law the crabs and want to pull it back down. What do we do with people who we can feel are trying to steal our happiness?
Well, first of all, you have to be aware that they're doing that and that it's just not you. So many times we become caretakers, or it's all about, we're giving all the time, like you said. But again, we have to have our own happiness, or else we're not going to be able to spread it to other people. And we can't set boundaries, and we need to set boundaries with toxic people. We can even say to them in a nice way, you know what we're talking about now isn't really giving me any kudos here. It's not helping me here. And so can we change the subject, or can we talk about something else, or can we go do something else, or whatever? But again, when people love to, when you're miserable, sometimes misery loves company, which is really sad, but we try to make people miserable at times, or there are people who do that. And so again, realizing that that's what they're doing.
And that's a great point. And I see this on a lot of different levels. Like some people, I think, don't even realize it, but they see someone else is happy and then comparison, and then they start being bugged and they kind of want to pop their bubble. Oh yeah, well, this really is the reality. Or this is really what's going on. So I don't know if you've noticed that kind of a thing. And it is having to stand firm in your happiness, having to stand strong and say, no, I get that, validating that difficulty, and I'm focused on the good. And like you said, being able to use your voice. I was working out with my trainer and she was so cute. I just started with her and she started talking about this serial murder kind of a thing while we're working out, just to try to help me not focus on, the pain of what I was doing, right? To her, that was so interesting. She was not even aware that I'm like, this is not anything I want to talk about. And I gave her a couple of subtle hints and she wasn't getting them. And then finally I said, I really need us to talk about something else more positive because that's not working for me. And it wasn't in a mean way or anything, but it was just clarity. Just clarity. And she was like, oh, she really did not realize that's where she was going. And so I love that you encourage, state your thought, speak your truth. Don't, not in a rude way, but just say, I'd really appreciate it. I know one phrase that has helped me throughout my life, and I learned it through a really grueling experience with carpool, where it was a nightmare. All these women were getting involved in all these specific parameters, and I was getting so overwhelmed. I thought, people, how can we make this complicated, right? But then this one woman said, you know what works for me is, boom, that has blessed my life. Now I just say that, you know what works for me is, and state what works for me. I'm happy to be flexible, but I have to share what works for me instead of 22 people saying, well, I don't know, what do you think? Well, we could do blah, 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 blah. What works for me is, man, get so much done quicker, faster, better. So I love these things. Anything you wanted to add on that?
Well, there's one other thing that I always tell people to say is sometimes when people are coming at you with, an alternative viewpoint that's really negative or something like that, or you don't agree, just say, I'm sorry you feel that way. Because again, that doesn't take responsibility for their negative thoughts. You're giving it back to them, and you're still retaining your integrity of how you're feeling. I'm sorry you're feeling that way. It doesn't agree. It doesn't disagree with them.
Yeah, and it's not teaching or trying to change. It's just validating. Oh, I'm so sorry you feel that way. I know some other phrases that I've heard people use that I love and I try to use myself is, wow, that's an interesting viewpoint. I appreciate you sharing that. I appreciate you sharing that. Then move on to something else so that they feel they had their moment and now we're moving on. I love that. These are so wonderful. For those that have just been joining us, a few wonderful things from Dr. Trish. She gave some great daily exercises for happiness. We talked about validating the difficult and valuing the positive. Talked about happiness is a practice. We need to practice that and choose intentionally how we want to experience or see the happiness factor in our lives every day. And I love that you have these things where you said, most of us, Nathaniel Brandon said, most of us sleepwalk through life. And you added on, so what's your legacy? And I added on, How are you going to live that today? I love this. Hopefully you got some great things. As always, if you loved it, subscribe below, make comments. We'd love to hear from you, and stay tuned for part 2, where we're going to talk about helping our children identify and choose happiness in their lives. We have so much of an epidemic of anxiety and depression and things like that in children. We want to be able to help them have these healthy mental and emotional wellness skills in their lives. So stay tuned for that. And as always, make this year your year to get balance redefined.